Hello and good morning friends, welcome to CEC-UGC live lecture. Dear friends, in this session today we are going to discuss about constitution, democratic functioning and women in India. As we have been discussing a lot about women, we are more focusing about the women's studies, and today also in this very lecture we will be discussing more on the women. And for this we have with us in our studios Dr. Sushila Kaushik. She is a retired professor. She has almost 40 years of teaching experience, as well as lots of her articles on women have been published in various journals. So first of all, I would like to welcome our guest Dr. Sushila Kaushik, and through her experience we would like to understand this very topic in detail. Welcome ma'am, welcome to the EduSet lecture, and as per our subject today, or the topic today is constitution, democratic functioning and women in India. From the very topic I could depict the various elements, and the third very element is the women, how the women is coordinated in all the two elements within the India. Please explain us in detail.
Yeah, I'm very happy I'm here this morning. Good morning Geetika, good morning my young friends. I do think when we approach and think in terms of the freedom and rights of women, which is normally what the women's studies do, we should have a backdrop of our entire country, its democratic pattern, the constitutional framework and the legal atmosphere which we have. I basically believe that women's studies should be constituted or put in the place of where it belongs to in the context. Then we may be able to understand it better when we talk about the women in India. That's why we are putting the three words together: democracy, constitution and then women. The three will really be operating together. To start with, I would like to sort of give a little background to the topic, little background to democracy, little background to the constitution, and how women figure in our constitution and our democracy. India started as a country which was freed from a colonial rule about now 60 years ago, and this remains still as a very great backdrop to anything which we do, any type of values we have inherited, and the values particularly of democracy, rule of law, liberty, equality, justice. All these values which we are talking in terms of women's studies are also values which we talk in terms of democracy. They are also the values which very much governed the making of our constitution. That's because our freedom struggle, which was there for more than 150 years in this country, was a peculiar freedom struggle. It was one which for the first time did not believe in blood and violence and wars, but one which gradually came up in a very slow process of fighting against the British colonial rulers, with a lot of complementary type of adjectives to it. Namely, it was extremely non-violent, very peaceful, very gradual, and above all, it was not totally only a political movement, but it also combined a lot of social reformist elements in it. From the very beginning, our freedom struggle started with certain items of social reform. In this social reform, from the very beginning, we also had the women's element put into it. So the reforms for women, for their status, for their education, for a lot of family life, property, and many other types of rights have been figuring even in our freedom struggle from the beginning. In fact, even before the proper political struggle started, we had social reformers like Rajaram Mohan Roy, Ishwar Vidyalanka, and many others who talked in terms of the reform for women. So when we started in 1885 with the Indian National Congress, already this element was there, and many women came out and participated from the very beginning in the Indian National Congress movement. So for India, the political struggle combined with the reform struggle, and in both of them, the women's aspects, the women's issues really figured from the very beginning. So that is precisely why some of our great women studies scholars like Professor Meera Desai, who has done a book on national movement and social reform, talks about the beginning of the social reforms and women's movement almost from the beginning of the 20th century, almost from 1900. So this is the reason why women, democracy, constitution very much go together in India. With this background around, I'll move further to talk about the nature of Indian democracy. For instance, India, when it became independent in 1947, there was a lot of doubts which are being expressed, namely that, just one second, which is being expressed that being a large and very highly populated country, India may not be able to govern itself very well. A lot of British politicians, including Churchill, expressed this doubt. Subsequently also, a lot of economists and political economists were talking in terms of India will never be able to govern itself, and there will be a quiet crisis in India if it tries to operate democracy in the backdrop of its social and economic backwardness. The main concern was, unlike the Western countries, we were not a developed country. They believed democracy and development go together. So democracy can function well only where there is a historical development, whereas when India became independent, it was a poverty-stricken country, it was colonially sort of exploited nation, where the population figure was a huge figure like 36 crores, where poverty was very high, where the industrial development was beginning but low, where the agricultural development and the social factors like caste, religion were very strong. But over a period of time, now that we are 60 years old, we can very proudly say that we have dealt with this. We have operated in the midst of all this socio-economic backwardness and the issues, but our democracy has really sustained itself over these years. In fact, India has become one very good example where the democracy has been introduced in a poor country, an illiterate country, but has succeeded in creating political consciousness, and it has worked reverse. Instead of democracy being drawn backward by our lack of development, our development has taken our democracy much forward. With the result, one of the big dreams which beliefs and faith which Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru really started, our democratic experiment in 1947, has very much come true. It was told that Indian women particularly are totally illiterate, very poor literary figures at that particular point, and that with these women around we can never succeed in our democracy. But the very first elections which were held in India in 1952, when Nehru saw the women getting on to all types of bullock carts and other types of conveyances and leaving their villages and merrily singing away and coming to the election booths in nearby towns and voting, Nehru wrote in his book, namely, this was one of the best moments he ever had, and it really fulfilled the hopes and the dreams he had for the Indian women. So it is not that the backwardness of India will draw the democracy back, but Nehru's faith was democracy, if it is introduced, especially universal adult suffrage, which was being introduced against all types of criticism, would in fact lead to empowerment, and from empowerment it will lead to development of women. Over the period of time, much of the dreams we talked about democracy in this country has come true. The other important aspect about democracy we need to talk about is the constitution framing. We adopted our Indian constitution in 1950. We adopted it after tremendous amount of discussions at the Constituent Assembly. And in the Constituent Assembly, once again the issues came up, illiteracy and many other issues which is really concerning the backwardness of women. But once again here too, the universal adult suffrage was not merely adopted, but also along with that, many other ideas about women's equality and justice came about. Though nothing much could be done immediately about the rights of women and the various social reforms about it, but what the Constitution did really well was to have introduced the element of equality and justice in the Constitution itself. With the result, the Constitution's fundamental rights portion, which is the real cornerstone of India's Constitution, the fundamental rights really mentions that there will be in the Article 14 that there will be no distinction on the basis of, apart from other things, caste, class, creed and sex. All these are vulnerable ideas in India. Caste is very strong, creed is very strong, inequality is very much there, and of course sexual discrimination, sexual divisions are extremely strong. So with the result, by putting it into the very fundamental rights, it gave us a basic nodal position on which we could fight in the succeeding years for various social reforms which we wanted to have for India. Also, the fundamental rights talked about equality of opportunity, and it said that no one will be discriminated or denied the equality of opportunity in the future democracy of India. The Constitution further said in another section called the Directive Principles of State Policy, it talked in two very important positions. One, it talked about as the bringing about of a uniform civil code. A uniform civil code essentially for women's sake, where all the rules and regulations for all the women irrespective of their caste or religion will be the same and will be progressive. The more important one, on the basis of which you could make a lot of laws and legislations and administrative policies in the future, was another clause, Article 15 of the Directive Principles of State Policy, where it says nothing in this Constitution will prevent the states from adopting any policies or measures which will promote the good of women and children. So this is putting along with the fundamental rights of the Indian Constitution. It in turn talks about the two together makes future Indian state adopt various policies and measures for the women in this country. So the government of India in subsequent years could make a lot of special provisions, special measures, special policies, even special laws for promoting the welfare and the empowerment of women without in any way going against the Constitution. However, the Constitution had another element in fundamental rights which sometimes becomes controversial in this country, which sometimes also is becoming little obstacle to another part of the Constitution directive principles, namely the Uniform Civil Code. Namely, the fundamental rights under the various circumstances in which we became independent, and because we believed very strongly in a secular republic, we also put it there as the various religions in this country can adopt their religious practices, can be no threat to the religious practices and customs, and they will be allowed to propagate their religion. This was a fundamental right given to, particularly in the context of the minorities in this country, and India definitely has some very major religions, 6 to 7 major religions among us. So this was to assure and guarantee the safety, security, protection, the cultural values and customs of the various religions in this country. What happened in it was many of these personal laws of the various religions in this country, including our major religion, namely Hinduism, many of these personal laws of these religions really went against the rights of the women or equality of women. Our religions by and large are really made by men, for men perhaps, so they have an element of patriarchy in them. So with the result, the personal laws concerning marriage, property, adoption and many other details, daily details, were prescribed by religion in this country. And if you cannot move in any way against the personal laws, then you can't bring about a uniform civil code in this country. This is the reason why even after about 60 years now, despite all the debates and discussions and demands from the women's movement as well as others, we are not in any way able to have a uniform civil code, because we have to guarantee our fundamental rights for the various religions. So unless the religions change themselves, they reform themselves and they adopt their personal laws or change their personal laws, the state as a whole is not in a position to bring about what you call the uniform civil code. But using the other provision of directive principles of state policy, which we talked about, the government over a period of time has come out with a various social legislations and laws and reforms, which to some extent takes care of the injustice or denial of rights for the women, even if it is on the basis of religion, customs and traditions in this country. So over a period we have been able to use our fundamental rights, our directive principles of state policy, above all our preamble, where we vowed to have an equal, secular, democratic, socialist republic. The Indian women have been able to benefit out of the democratic practices which is enshrined, of democratic values which have been enshrined in our constitution. So this is where, irrespective of our developmental indicators, which are very poor compared to many countries in the world even now, we still have a certain amount of a higher measure for gender development index. Slowly the gender disparity is also coming down, though there is still a vast gap between men and women in our country. Now these are all in a way a background to another topic I am going to talk about, namely the politics of India and women. Because now we are 60 years old, and in our parliaments we have been having women. In fact, in our Constituent Assembly we had a set of very powerful women who are members. But subsequently, over a period of time, the number of women in our parliament and assemblies was constantly coming down. The voting percentage of women were coming down, and it was though enthusiastic, still for various reasons the turnout of women were less than that of men. But in the past 60 years we have had 16 elections to Lok Sabha and any number of elections to various Vidhan Sabha state assemblies. I'll talk about the local government later, and we find that there are certain, though the figures are still less, the certain improvement is constantly coming up in front of us. We have found that in the past 16 years, 16 elections, the number of women who are voting in the elections is going up slowly. So we have reached now in the 16th Lok Sabha elections somewhere 64%, while in 1952, the first elections, we had only 37% of women voting. As contestants, when we see, again we find more and more women are coming out as contestants than they were before. It was just 51 women who contested in 1952, the first elections, to today we have 631 women who contested for the recent Lok Sabha elections in 2014. Again, when we see how many of them succeeded in the elections, the number has increased, though extremely marginally and sometimes very unhappily. We have come up a little bit now. We have in 2014 election, we have got 11.3% of our Lok Sabha members to be women. This is only slightly more than the last election, which was in 2009, where it was 11%. So in the past 5 years, we have been able to increase only by 0.3%, which is not something which we are happy about, because the women's movement in India have been fighting for the past 30-40 years to have at least 33% reservation in our parliament and in our state assemblies. So what we have achieved by 11.3 is a far cry and a very small amount compared to what we want to have, namely 33.3%. Because there are a lot of countries in the world who have had much better figure than us, like the Norwegian governments, the Scandinavian countries, the Italians and the Palestine, many other countries we could talk about, Israel, who all have a much better figure than we have. But There are also a lot of countries which are much poorer than us, but we would like to really go up, follow the example of the Scandinavian countries, so that women can play a very, very active role in policy making and in governance of this country, particularly in Lok Sabha but and state assemblies. So this is still a little more we have not been able to achieve, but on the whole, in a way, the women are improving by way of participation in politics. In the recent elections, in fact, in about 16 states, 16 out of 29 states, in 16 states, more women turned up in the election than the men. And there are states like Kerala, where the women's figures are much higher. So also the northeastern states, the turnout by women have been very high. They also are countries, they also are states which has a higher sex ratio of women. So these are developed sort of areas within India, where in 16 of them more women came out than men in voting in the elections. However, the voter turnout automatically does not mean more women are contesting in the elections. In fact, it's a contradiction. It's a very strange type of a contradiction in India, that states where the women turn out plenty and more than men are the states where there are no women representation at all. States like the northeastern states, Manipur, Meghalaya, which are all very advanced states, or Kerala, have been sending the fewest number of women to our parliament. Whereas states like UP, Madhya Pradesh, Bihar, which we considered as backward states of India by way of cultural indicators or human development indicators or gender development indicators, where the women's mortality rate is very high, infant mortality rate is very high, illiteracy is very high. In these states, we have more and more of women contesting the elections. So this is a strange contradiction which we have, where the development does not follow politics. Where we should have more development of women if more women are there in the representative positions in our parliament as well as in policy making, decision making levels of our states or the country. This gap need to be filled up. I am sure in the course of time this gap will get filled up a little by little. Over a period of time, however, using the various provisions in the constitution like directive principles and fundamental rights, the state in India and many states in India both, the Indian state has enacted a lot of social legislations for women. Starting with 1950 to 54 reforms for women, especially which came to be called as Hindu Code Act. Because of the provisions of the fundamental right respecting the personal laws of the various religions, because we couldn't bring about a uniform civil code in this country, the government of India had to resort to separating the women, and so we had a series of legislations which came together called as Hindu Code Bill, then became Hindu Code Act. This was under the great leadership of Pandit Nehru, who was extremely keen about it. So the Hindu women began getting for the first time right to property, right to inheritance property, right to have divorce, right for after divorce, marriage again, remarriage, and also little later many other reforms which followed these fundamental reforms. So this is where we had the foundations for the majority women to start with. In subsequent years, the state has even gone into some of these laws and legislations which have reformed Indian women's position. Like recently, we have the prevention of dowry legislation, which dowry was considered essentially as a feature of Hindu marriages, but which has gone on to other religions also recently. So the prevention of dowry has been a very great landmark which was adopted by Indian state and all the states, which is trying to, even if it cannot succeed completely, but trying to abolish dowry or at least reduce dowry and the dowry menace in this country. Because it is this dowry which made the position of women extremely unequal. Women girls particularly have been considered as a luggage, a burden, by the parents, because this dowry was really pulling them down, and there was a son preference which came up mainly because of this dowry, and that increased our female infanticide rate, or what we now say feticide, and all these things are the resultant in a way of the parents feeling or the grandparents feeling girl child is a burden rather than an asset. So dowry to a great extent would reduce this feeling and thereby perhaps bring about the corresponding reforms by way of feticide, infant mortality, as well as even maternal mortality in this country. The same thing also has led to a sort of a domestic violence in this country. Tremendous amount of domestic violence for various reasons or no reason has been taking place in this country. So the state has been able to recently formulate a bill, which is an act on the prevention of domestic violence for women, which has gone beyond just wife and husband, but also includes all the women who are within the household, including now by its expansion, including the women who have been employed in the house, those who live within the four walls of any house, have been brought into under this domestic violence bill, and that has been tremendous help for a lot of women who have been suffering this domestic violence quite silently because of our social constructions, and also the lack of alternate in front of them. So domestic violence has gone to great extent. We will talk about some other time in details about them, but right now it is a legislation which the government has made for the sake of removing this inequality and discrimination, reducing if not totally eliminating the patriarchal features of a family and a household in this country. More recently, the landmark legislation has been about the sexual harassment of women in workplace. Women who are wanting to go out have been increasingly coming out to work in offices and other places outside homes. Women have always been working inside the house, both by way of domestic chores as well as household occupations. But more and more women are now coming out to work in offices, public places, and the type of harassment which they go through in these public places is something which has been hampering their progress, hampering further women coming out, and will also lead to a certain amount of dropout from employment if the present position continues. So with the result, a lot of women made a demand, and this is a form of a violence against women in public places. So the Supreme Court judgment which came out strongly supporting the women and strongly opposing the sexual harassment has now been called the Vishaka judgment, has now been converted into an act. So the act is now a very strong act which is being uniformly followed all over India, both in the public sector as well as in the private sector, and both in the offices as well as even universities and colleges, and all the places where women really go out to. And not merely just a workplace, but even for students, even for those who coming as a research scholar, or those who travel by buses, or by even cyberspace based sexual harassment. All these are being brought under this new prevention of or atrocities against women in the form of sexual harassment, which is working in this country. One can go on narrating a lot more legislations which have come to promote the women's development and empowerment in this country. In fact, as figures go, perhaps India should be one country which has the maximum number of social legislations, out of which quite a bit are for women's promotion, which is really worthy of India's democracy. It's maybe different issue how many of them are being implemented, how many of them can be implemented to the extent which we women need, and how many of them still are falling short of our expectations, and women are still suffering within the family, in the offices, and all types of violence is still taking place. If anything, the violence is increasing. The more the legislations, the more seem to be the violence against women, and that's a blot on our democracy. But now that the legislation and the legal framework and the legal basis is there, we should be able to get rid of this blot and able to reduce the violence against women sooner or later. But the most important problem, issue which I want to talk about it when we think in terms of democracy and development in this country is the issue of local governance. We talked about the national governance, we talked a little bit about the state, because the state in this country really follow the national example and the constitution. All the legislation made by in New Delhi definitely become applicable to all parts of India, and some states have even improved upon them, especially from the point of view of property ownership. Many states in India have adopted more liberal even proposition than we have in the central legislation. We also have a lot of variations by way of tribal customs, which are especially around in the northeastern states of India, where position of women often is considered as a little better than the others, because we have recognized those tribal customs and codified and adopted them as part of our state structure. But when it comes to the local level, the rural level, the villages level, there were still a lot of problems involved, particularly when it comes to the patriarchal nature of our household, patriarchal nature of our politics, and the lack of fundamental rights and their enjoyment for women in the rural side of India, because of the backwardness, because of religion being much stronger, customs being much stronger, and the illiteracy of the women in the rural side. The participation of women in public life in rural side has been quite bleak over the period of time. Much of the indicators we get for improvement comes from the urban side of India rather than the rural side of India. So the special attention had to be paid for the rural side and the rural governance in this country. So by 1992-93, we had adopted what we have now called the 72nd and 73rd Amendment to our Panchayati Raj and the urban development or municipalities in this country. This is a very earth-shaking experiment we did it. This is the most advanced experiment India has done, and India has been the first country in the world which, and a backward country, which has come out with 33.3% representation. That's 1/3 representation for women in the local government structures, both by way of membership as well as by way of chairmanship of these various agencies. No other country followed it, adopted it before us, but a lot of countries have followed us after this, especially in South Asia. Many countries like Nepal, Bangladesh, Pakistan have adopted such a reservation quota at the local level in their own countries. But it's not a new movement. The Panchayati Raj is an old institution in this country. Historically, it has been there even during the colonial rule, and the elderly Panch persons in the villages have been deciding a lot of issues for the villages. We had this model of village republics, perhaps even in our ancient India, but not all of them were really functioning in a modern progressive form, and definitely women were nowhere in this. The Panchas always were men, elders, and so they were more conservative, and many of their laws and regulations they adopted, or customs they sort of enforced, and judgments they gave in various cases were all against the vulnerable sections, weaker sections, and which woman is one of the vulnerable sections. So these sort of panchas were extremely patriarchal, conservative in the type of panchayats we had before. So by 1956-57, Nehru had moved into this matter. The first Panchayati Raj we had formulated in the modern sense of the word was in 1957, inaugurated at in Rajasthan at a place called Nagaur, where the modern panchayats came into being with elected panchayats. But it did not spread much, it did not move around the rest of India. So by the 1960s, again we talked about it. We had 2 or 3 committee reports. There was this Ashoka Mehta committee report during the Janata regime, and the Janata regime enforced it, and the first state which adopted the Ashoka Mehta committee report and brought about an elected panchayat, the credit really goes to Andhra Pradesh and its great leader N.T. Ramarao, who introduced this Mandal system. And it went beyond the previous experiment and brought in women in as a reserved category in the panchayats in Andhra. But it took another 10-15 years before we could bring it about in the national level. Under Rajiv Gandhi's prime ministership, we moved much further to bring about these Panchayat Raj amendments into our constitution. Rajiv Gandhi didn't think of it individual states, but the whole India, and called it more a constitutional amendment rather than just a reform or a legislation. Unfortunately, it passed in Lok Sabha but failed in Rajya Sabha, so we couldn't do it. So when Narasimha Rao became the chief prime minister of this country, it was then passed. So it came to be now called 72nd and 73rd Amendment. 72nd talking about Panchayati Raj, that is the rural sphere, and 73rd talking about municipalities, that is the urban side of India. In all this, there are some very essential features. The most important aspect of these amendments was giving representation to the weaker sections. Not merely women, scheduled castes, scheduled tribes also got reservation and quota in proportion to their own population figure in the particular state. In the case of women, of course, uniformly all over India, it was adopted as 1/3 reservation, that is 33.3%. In addition to membership, the chairmanship also will be rotatory. So the vulnerable sections, namely SC, ST and women, will also get chairmanship in 1/3 of it in the entire country by a rotation basis. By making it a rotation basis, the amendments brought it to all the wards in rotation, so that every ward in a village, every ward in a town will get their due share by way of representation and quota, so that the entire country gets reflected at the end of 3 elections. Almost all wards, all sections of the country would have a representation in this reservation, and women and the SCs from all the population will have their representatives in this. So this principle was adopted by a constitutional amendment, which means it becomes permanent. It becomes sort of, every government will have to adopt it. It can be amended but cannot be given up. So this is a very important step for not merely our local governance, for our democracy, for our local development, but is extremely important also for vulnerable sections. For the first time, SCs and women could come into a panchayat chairmanship position or sit in position of equality in the panchayat structures, many of which were extremely caste oriented or patriarchy oriented before, and they had the equal rights in panchayats. So it also, apart from dealing with the political representation for these sections, it also dealt with by way of caste system. It also talked in terms of gender equality. It also talked in terms of the caste reforms in this country, thereby bringing equality among all the sections of this country. So this is an extremely far-reaching one. And so far from the first elections we have had was in 1993. From there to now, we have had a series of elections all over India on the Panchayati Raj and the urban municipalities. Thereby, the rural side of India particularly has got much political consciousness, awareness, and the women particularly have got a lot of political empowerment in the rural side, irrespective of the literacy figure. So one doesn't talk anymore about illiterate women being politically not conscious. One finds whether they are literate or illiterate, poor or rich, low caste or higher caste, whichever tribes they may belong to, the women in the rural side of India have become very much politically conscious, quite big democratic, knowing their rights or wanting to know their rights, and many of them have got also the experience in governing, because a lot of them have sat there as the chairperson of their bodies, of their committees. So many of the issues of the nation are now being reflected in the debates in the villages. I can say that very personally. I've gone so much around, I've seen the women of all ages and find how through the Panchayati Raj powers, through their participation Panchayati Raj, through their political awakening and participation Gram Sabha meetings, many women have been able to also bring about changes in their own personal lives, in their own domestic lives, in their own equality, justice concepts. So one finds the women of India in villages talking much more and more able and more empowered than ever before. So this is an experiment in which democracy has succeeded quite a lot in this country, though we still will believe that there are a lot of contradictions, there are still a lot of gaps in the lives of women as such. So the highlights of women's participation is something which I consider is not merely important for women, but they are important for the nation as a whole. As you say, Nehru is always quoted or Gandhi is always quoted, if a woman develops, the family develops. In case the women gets the rights development, the families will develop. I will go further that if the women develop, the nation would develop, and the nation is developing gradually. So that's what very often Panchayati Raj experiment has been called by many as a silent revolution in the villages of India, in the village side of India. Indian democracy itself is over a period of time a silent but gradual revolution in more than one way, and even when the whole of South Asia or many other countries in the world have gone through changes in their structure, changes in their nature, changes in their democratic ideology, we in India have stood our ground that the democracy has been more or less very regularly operated in this country. We have had our regular elections, we have had our parliamentary form of government, we have had opposition, we are following almost all the rules and regulations which we inherited when we copied the parliamentary democracy model of Great Britain when we became independent. So far, the operation of the parliamentary democracy has been quite successful. There may be in between every now and then some challenges, some weaknesses, some criticism, but we have stood our ground much more than any other country around us, Pakistan, Nepal, or Bangladesh, or Sri Lanka, because we have uninterrupted democracy. Of course, of late, all those countries also have gone through elections and are operating more or less on the same pattern, but we have had an uninterrupted, regular way of, and the values of democracy has become deeply ingrained in the Indians, and it is becoming more and more liberated and liberal by way of various technical and other methods. So the type of social interactions which are taking place, which is now coming up as a result of the high technological development which is taking place in this country, is an add-on to our democratic values and practices, and they will strengthen the democratic practices in this country. But constitution, democracy, structures, they are all just one part of our democracy, democratic operations. There are also other ones which also try to deal with this. Elections is one. Elections is a political process which we have been having very regularly, and the election commission over a period of time has become one of the strongest structures in our country. It's one of those which is very well respected in this country, and one which has come to be even adopted with great fear by our politicians and political parties, so that the election commission, when it comes to a code of conduct, it becomes binding on all the political parties. Thereby, as much as possible, the election commission is trying to conduct our vast elections in a clean and clear process. In fact, India has the greatest number of electorate in the world, with the greatest number of backwardness and other types of disadvantages and poverty. Despite that, the election commission has been holding the elections and give us a clean and fair elections in the past so many instances we have had. But of course, the society and the politics also govern our elections. So in the recent years, we find more and more criminals and more those rapists and many others who have done sexual offenders coming out as candidates in the election. We also find more and more use of money, so the cost of elections is going up very high, thereby once again depriving the vulnerable, weaker, poorer sections, including women, from contesting the elections. Also the muscle power, the physical force, the violence is increasing tremendously in our elections, and that's again a cause for which the women are paying a price, because that's one which really hampers the women's moving forward and contesting the elections and getting it as candidates. With the result, our figures in elections are still very low, mainly because of this crime, muscle and the money powers which is getting into our elections, which the Election Commission is trying to control through various mechanisms, but it will take some more time perhaps before these type of features of our elections will completely get reduced. With more and more political awareness and consciousness of the voters, maybe we will succeed in this, and a lot of technological type of inputs are coming in, which is exposing the candidates so that the people can choose better candidates in the elections. The other important structure we have is our political parties. No democracy can operate now without political parties. Definitely a parliamentary democracy cannot operate without political parties. Political parties is really the lubricant of a democracy. They serve extreme purposes in a democracy. They conduct the elections, they manage the elections, they choose the candidates, they do the propaganda, they do the lobbying and advocacy. And once they are chosen, they are the ones who are managing even the governance of this country. But somehow the political parties in this country have given least attention to the women and the weaker section in this country. The manifestos of late definitely talk about a lot of issues concerning them, but when it comes to choosing them as candidates or winning them the elections, the political parties still are very reluctant to put up more and more women. We find not even one political party in this country has given a double-digit number by way of women candidates, with the result when they win, no party has a double-digit number of members in the parliament. This is a field where we have to work very strongly with the political parties. The political parties will begin thinking, we should think that women are a big vote bank, and they will vote better if the more women are made to contest. They should give up the feeling that women are not winnable candidates. They think women are not winning candidates because women have no private property of that nature. Women cannot put in too much money into the election and campaigning. There is no muscle power with women. Not many women want to engage muscle men, and because of which the political parties are not giving women any great candidate, and because of which women's issues are also not really very well articulated, lobbied or followed or implemented by the parties which are in governance in various parts of India. Almost all political parties are in governance either at the center or in some states of India, but even then the women's issues do not get the top priority because the political parties do not still think of women as a big vote bank in this country who will influence the electoral results. I think the more women should come forward, more women should attend the parties, more women should become members. There are very few members who are in political parties, and that would make perhaps the political parties think of women as a very important component of their own parties and candidates and the elections and the manifestos, without which of course women can never participate fully in the democracy of this particular country. Even when the women are participating, the issue always comes up, how many women are in decision making level. Congress may have about 30 members at a particular time in parliament, or some other parties may have enough numbers in the parliament, but when it comes to making the ministers either of the cabinet rank or of the ministers of state level, the parties are very reluctant to give women those positions. We always have, in the past few elections after 1970s, in the past few cabinets and governments, only one woman as a token element in the cabinet. The center did it, now all the states are following it. You are finding just one woman out of 10 or one woman out of 20 or one woman out of 30 becoming a cabinet minister. We may have one or two ministers among women in the council of ministers, which is a lower level of power and decision making in the parliamentary form of government. And even when they are there, they are often given portfolios like women and child development, social welfare, things of that nature, soft options, rather than defense, home, finance, some sort of where the expertise and skills are needed. Obviously, the political leaders still believe, political parties still believe, women are not capable or women do not have the skills to handle important portfolios in this country. So that position need to be reversed. More and more women should get into these positions. More and more women should become the managers in this country. More and more women should become heads of the institutions. Out of I don't know how many universities we have in this country, only about 3% of them have at any particular point of time women as vice chancellors. And they once again believe the role of a vice chancellor is more of a law and order issue, so women cannot handle it at all. It's becoming very sad that the women are considered as vice chancellors only in the women's only university, which are 6 in number in this country, and only other universities consider them very occasionally, and about 5 women are vice chancellors in the other type of universities, the co-ed universities. Only women's universities by statutes have to have women vice chancellors. We also do not have women very often in our delegations, foreign delegations particularly, peace delegations particularly, United Nations delegations, and many other places. Women definitely can contribute a lot to peace and negotiations. They are temperamentally and ideologically believe in peace, believe not in war. So they should be more and more utilized, but they are not utilized. So it's not enough if we come forward and participate. We also need to be identified, women need to be identified in positions of decision making, policy making. This is necessary for the country because unless you sit at the policy making and decision making level, the women oriented programs, women targeted programs can never be formulated. Many of our programs are really faulty, and they are at least default when you begin applying them in the patriarchal setup of our villages or families. Mainly because the men who are sitting there are not able to think about what contradictions, what implications a policy or a program will have on the women and the children of this country, because they have never experienced it, they won't be able to imagine it even. So more and more women should sit in this governance, in policy making bodies at the decision making level, so that the policies and decisions reflect the realities of the lives of women and children, and also come out with measures which will directly target women and not be targeted at men. That is a very great drawback we have in all over India, but definitely in India, all over the world, but definitely in India, where the policies miserably fail because the policies are not targeted at the particular target group for whom you are making the policies. And how that come to be manipulated is something which women alone will be able to reflect on it. So for this purpose only, very often the women's movement in this country want more and more women to be in governance, in management, at the managerial position, at the policy making position, and policy enforcement position. So one needs to believe that democracy and development will succeed very well in this country only if women come more and more into politics. That's why the women's movement has been for the past many years, more than 25 years really now, arguing for a reservation and a quota for women in all these positions, in civil services, in management levels, in delegations and committees, and above all in the parliament and state assemblies. While we succeeded with local government, the women have not been able to succeed with the national, state level. The bill came up for the women's reservation, was introduced about 10 years back almost. Many times it was introduced, many times it had to be withdrawn or dropped, mainly because the opposition to the bill was tremendous. For one reason or other, it couldn't get through. It almost started from the time of Narasimha Rao's government. Now it is so many years, but 3-4 times it has been brought up, 3-4 times it has been withdrawn, because the men in the parliament have been thoroughly opposing it. Even in all the women members of the parliament have been together supporting it, both in the Lok Sabha as well as in Rajya Sabha. Finally in the last Lok Sabha, the bill came up at the Rajya Sabha level. The reason is, when the election comes, the Lok Sabha gets dissolved. Along with that, all the bills which are in the Lok Sabha gets lapsed. But Rajya Sabha does not have any dissolution like this. It continues as an institution. So if a bill is introduced, it doesn't die down. It continues to be there. So the bill was finally introduced in Rajya Sabha when Najima Heptullah was the chairperson of Rajya Sabha. It was passed. Then it has to come to the Lok Sabha. But it is pending and pending and pending. The bill has not yet been introduced in Lok Sabha. Every session comes in 15th Lok Sabha or 14th Lok Sabha, and it still doesn't pass. But the bill doesn't fail, the bill doesn't lapse, because it's still alive in the Rajya Sabha records. So it has to be taken by Lok Sabha sooner or later. And the reason why we need this 33.3% in Lok Sabha and Rajya Sabha is mainly because women by themselves are not able to get rid of this patriarchal order in our politics. Because of this, not in development. Because of this, not in family either. And with the present type of a strong patriarchal order all along the line in our society and in our politics, women on their own will not be able to come up in the governance and democracy and development of this country. So one requires this reservation almost like a last resort. And that's how it has come up in Panchayat Raj, that's how it's doing wonders in the rural side. So one believes it will do similar wonders for the country as a whole, because women's development is extremely necessary for national development. Women's empowerment is necessary if you want India to be a strong nation, and it's necessary for the women also. So ultimately, the democracy and development in this country, while it is successful in many ways, from women's perspective, it still has a little drawback which we need to remedy sooner or later. Then we can consider Indian democracy very successful.
Definitely, ma'am. All what you said is very fruitful at the point of view to understand the condition of the women in India as well as for the further development of the country. As you said, the representation of the women, whether in the parliament or her reservation in the different fields, would obviously empower her. With this note, thank you, ma'am. Thank you so very much. And I hope that in future lectures also we would be studying more on the women. Thank you, ma'am. Thank you so very much.